In this screencast, we will take a closer look at how modern plants and algae produce a type of renewable energy, and then we'll compare that type of renewable energy with fossil fuel energy. So biomass. Biomass means biological solid materials that can be used for fuel. There's also liquid biofuels, but right now we're just going to consider the solid ones called biomass. Biomass comes from wood, charcoal, manure, and municipal solid waste. Here we use the word wood loosely. It's primarily by wood, but it could be from other plants. Charcoal is not like coal. It's not a mineral. Charcoal is a product that is made by burning wood and condensing the energy into a smaller, more dense unit called charcoal. Manure is the fecal material of chickens and other animals such as cows and pigs that can also be burned for fuel. And municipal solid waste is trash, and that's where the vast majority of our trash goes. It is converted into electricity by burning it. So biomass may be a good energy source, but it may contribute to pollution and health problems as well. So one thing that we looked at already was the use by the country of Haiti to create charcoal for sale to the Dominican Republic. And that posed health risk to them in terms of direct burning, any particulates that were breathed in. It also served as a source of health issues when the land was deforested and then mudslides occurred, which killed individuals. Same with as we looked at during the air pollution chapter, or we'll look at during the air pollution chapter. Sometimes when these materials are burned, and in particular when manure is burned, there is particulate matter that is generated. There can also be carbon monoxide generated. And if you live within an enclosed dwelling that doesn't have a lot of ventilation, that can lead to carbon monoxide poisoning, which can lead to death. It can lead to increased infections and increased cancers of the respiratory system. We'll look at municipal solid waste when we look at the next chapter. Okay, in addition to those solid biofuels, we have liquid biofuels, and the two main ones are ethanol and biodiesel. So these are used as substitutes for gasoline and substitutes for diesel fuel. And it's debated often whether these are environmentally sound alternatives. So let's look first at ethanol. Ethanol is produced in the United States from corn, and it's added to gasoline. If you look at your gas pump when you're filling your car, you will see that the gas is 90% gas plus 10% ethanol, and that's known as gasohol. So though you're using less fossil fuel and using more biologically friendly fuel, unfortunately, ethanol does not contain as much energy as 100% gasoline. And therefore, it's not as efficient in your miles per gallon. You lose miles per gallon in your efficiency when you add ethanol to gasoline. And another problem with it is that you need fossil fuels to grow the corn. And you have already looked at industrial agriculture and how fossil fuels are used to plant and harvest and process and move these materials. So the fossil fuels that are needed to grow the corn may not really save you that much in terms of fossil fuels that are used. And so the use of ethanol in the long run, it has been determined that it actually results in increased atmospheric CO2 levels because of this material needed to produce the corn. So moving on to biodiesel. Biodiesel is not produced from corn. It's typically produced from soybean, and it also may be produced from palm oils. It can also be extracted from vegetable oil that was produced as waste at restaurants, and that can be on a very small scale, of course. So large-scale production is based typically on a soybean crop. Then depending how it's produced, it may or may not be carbon neutral. So again, you have the same problem with the planting, harvesting, and shipping of the soybean product, the biodiesel product, which may result in it producing as much CO2 or more than it would have if we just used plain old diesel. So the question leads us to the question, is modern carbon versus fossil carbon, which one is better for the environment and for human health? So thinking back on what I just said about the sources of modern carbon and the sources of fossil carbon, why might it be better to burn biomass such as wood rather than a fossil fuel such as coal? So let me go back a step. Remember, fossil fuel, we're talking about fuels that came from the remains of organisms that lived millions of years ago. So that's your coal, oil, and natural gas. Modern carbons are the ones that I just introduced on this screencast. So those are things like your biofuels and your biomass. And it would seem intuitive that that is still better than using a fossil fuel. But let's take a look at that and consider the factors. The carbon found in biomass is modern, meaning that it existed in the atmosphere recently as carbon dioxide. It was taken in by vegetation through the process of photosynthesis. And burning the plants then results in modern carbon being returned to the atmosphere where it had just been recently. So if vegetation is allowed to grow back, then new vegetation will take up the same amount of CO2, more or less equal to the amount that was just released by burning it. And over time, the net change in atmospheric CO2 concentrations should be zero. That's called carbon neutral. And that would be a really good thing. Now let's take a look at coal, which is a form of fossil carbon. That's carbon that's been buried for millions of years and was out of circulation until we began very recently to use it. Now it's being returned to the atmosphere over a relatively short period of time. This results in a rapid increase in the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and it is not carbon neutral. But you do need to consider some other factors. Ethanol, as I previously mentioned, it reduces the efficiency by about 2 to 3% in the miles per gallon. And growing corn uses significant amounts of fossil fuels. Biodiesels, again, it requires less fossil fuel than corn, but it uses more land, which we could use for other things such as food crops to feed a growing population. So in the future, these various forms of biomass are being studied to see if we can find, for example, a better source for ethanol than corn. So switchgrass is one of those substitutes that might be working, though they have been researching this for decades at this point and haven't made tremendous progress yet. But switchgrass grows very low dry conditions, very low water conditions. It grows quickly, and it would probably be a better substitute than corn. And then for biodiesel, as opposed to using things like soybean, you can actually use algae. And there's actually a lot of research being done right here on the Cape to produce biodiesel from algae. It can also be produced by using wood waste that would otherwise go to waste, and that can be converted as well. So overall, which is better? Well, oops. There we go. So it is better to burn biomass rather than a fossil fuel because it's renewable, and as long as we can, and it can be carbon neutral, that's the main thing, and as long as we employ proper farming practices that don't require larger amounts of water, larger amounts of land, or compete even for price of corn, for example, when it's being used as a biofuel, then it's not going to be it's going to cost more than it would be for the farmer who's selling it to produce a food product. Okay. Okay, that'll be it for this screencast. I will move on to other forms of renewable or non-depletable, which is lumped in with renewable energy sources.